this city. Nelson Tiff died November 21st, 1891, 113 years ago yesterday. And if you've picked up a newspaper today anywhere in this country, you also probably know that 50 years ago today, John F. Kennedy died. So these are two special Americans in their own way, who this week we remember. And so as a former history teacher, I'm still recovering. I've got this affliction where when things happen in history, I kind of want to dig deeper and see if there are any other patterns. So I was interested to see, beyond these two important Americans for different reasons, what maybe happened this week in history that's specifically geared towards the Jewish people in America and perhaps worldwide. And so I did some research and I found, I guess not surprisingly, a lot has happened involving Jews in this country this week in years past. I'm not going to share everything I found with you because that might take some time. But as a teenager, Jack Albertson, he was born in Malden, Massachusetts. He left Malden, Massachusetts as a teenager for the Great White Way in New York. He had this dream, and lo and behold, this guy wound up over the next 60 years having quite the career. He's in a very elite class of people who have won Oscar, Tony, and Emmy Awards. Not bad for a Jewish high school dropout son of immigrant parents from Russia. So Jack Albertson, he played a lot of roles over 60 years, but the one that will always be Jack Albertson to me is Grandpa Joe from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Okay, so maybe you know the story. Grandpa Joe, after 20 years of being bedridden, Charlie comes home with a golden ticket, and this gets him out of his bed. And he goes and he accompanies Charlie to the factory, and then we fast forward through all of the adventures, and in the end of the story, after all of the other kids have been eliminated from this competition, which we don't yet know is actually a competition, after they're all gone, finally Willy Wonka also eliminates Charlie because Charlie had broken a rule with his grandfather along the way. And so Charlie does the right thing. After Grandpa yells at Wonka, Charlie goes and he returns the everlasting gobstopper that's in his pocket. And so with that one act of goodness, Wonka turns to Charlie and says, "You did it. You won the competition." The competition Charlie didn't even know was going on. And so they board this glass elevator, the Wonkavator. And I just love the text, the actual dialogue. It says, "This Wonkavator," Wonka explains, "goes sideways and slantways and longways and backways and squareways and frontways and any other ways you can think of, just by pressing these buttons. Until now, I've pressed all of them except this one. Hold tight. I'm not sure what's going to happen. Faster. Faster. If we don't pick up enough speed, we'll never get through." At which point, Grandpa jumps in and says, "But the roof is made of glass. It'll shatter into 1,000 pieces. We'll be cut to ribbons." "Probably. Hold on, everybody." So Wonka doesn't know any better than Grandpa what's actually going to happen. The only thing Wonka knows is that if they don't try hard, they're not going to get through. And if they don't get through, they will never know what's on the other side. Life will continue on just as it has been. They'll live, they'll probably be content enough. Life is life. But Wonka thinks, who in life should really be content with enough, with content? There's always something more on the other side. And he wants to get there, and he's going to make sure he brings other people with him. I think we all deserve to see what's on that other side, and we keep looking. It's hard to know where that last button is. So for tonight, I'm thinking maybe, if we all do it together, maybe that last button is somewhere here in this room. Maybe it has something to do with our coming together, welcoming in Shabbat, finding something over the next 25 hours of Shabbat. We'll see, it doesn't hurt to try. It's my honor, if she's here, to invite Laura Fink-Renner. Oh, there, I'm sorry. I didn't even see you up front, right in front of my nose, to light the Shabbat candles for us. It's on page 2 of the prayer book.
As these Shabbat candles give light to all who behold them, so may we, by our lives, give light to all who behold us. As their brightness reminds us of generations of Israel who have kindled light, as may we, in our own day, be among those who kindle light. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu v'halech ner shel Shabbat. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, the sovereign of the universe, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to kindle the light of Shabbat.
On page 10, Ma yafeh hayom, how beautiful is this day. Ma yafeh hayom, Shabbat shalom. Ma yafeh hayom, Shabbat shalom. Shabbat, Shabbat shalom. Shabbat, Shabbat shalom. Shabbat, Shabbat shalom. Shabbat shalom. And you all have some handouts in front of you, some supplemental readings. I'd like to turn to the page that has on top of it, Sabbath Queen, a poem by Chaim Nachman Bialik, one of the most renowned poets of Israel. We will read responsively. Sabbath Queen. The sun has already disappeared beyond the treetops. Come, let us go and welcome the Sabbath Queen. She is already descending among us, holy and blessed, and with her are angels, a host of peace and rest. Come, O Queen. Come, O Queen. Be unto you, O angels of peace. Sit among us, O pure Shabbat Queen, and enlighten us with your splendor. Tonight and tomorrow, then you may pass on. And we, for our part, will honor you by wearing beautiful clothing, by singing Zmirot, by praying, and by eating 3 meals, and with complete rest, and with pleasant rest. Bless me with peace, O angels of peace. On page 20, we sing the song of welcoming Shabbat, of going out into the fields and bringing Shabbat in, ushering in the Shabbat Queen. We will sing verses 1, 2, 5, and 9 of Lecha Dodi. Lecha Dodi likrat kala, penei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha Dodi likrat kala, penei Shabbat nekabela. Shamor v'zachor b'dibor echad, Hishmi'anu el hamyuchad, Adonai echad, U'shemo echad, L'shem u'tiferet v'retila. Lecha dodi, Lecha dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. Likrat Shabbat lechu v'necha, Ki hi mekor habracha, Merosh mikedem nesucha, Sof ma'aseh b'machshavat chila. Lecha dodi, Lecha dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. Verse 5. Hitoreri, Kiva orech kumi ori, udri, shir daberi, Kevod Adonai alayich nigla. Lecha dodi, Lecha dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. We rise on verse 9. Bo'vi v'shalom ateret ba'ala, Gam besimcha uvetzahala, Toch emunei am segula, Bo'vi chala, bo'vi chala. Lecha dodi, Lecha dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. You may be seated. On page 26, we will bring the first part of our service to a close with a Chatzi Kaddish. Yitkada v'yitkadash shemei Rabba, Be'amad divrach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei, B'chayechon u'yovmechon uv'chaye dechot Beit Yisrael, Bagala, bagala, uvizman kadriv, ve'imru. Yehi shmei Rabba mevarach, le'olam o'ame amayach, yitbarach, yitbarach, v'yishtabach, v'yitpa'ar v'yitrama, v'yitnaseh, Vayitadar, vayitale, vayitala, Shemei de Kudesha, Leila min kol birchata v'shirata, Tushbechata v'nechemata, Damiram be'alma, Imru. We rise on page 28 for the call to worship. Baruch hu et Adonai hamivorach. Baruch Adonai hamivorach leolam vaed. may be seated. On the handouts that you have, on the same piece of paper that you've already read from on the flip side, Ma'ariv Aravim, as we recognize the wonders of this time of day, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam asher bidvaro ma'ariv aravim b'chokhmah poteach she'arim. We read responsively in the English. As day departs, as the dark of night descends, we lift our eyes to the heavens. In awe and wonder, our hearts cry out. A vast universe, who can know it? What mind can fathom it? We look out to the endless suns and ask, what are we? What are our dreams and our hopes? And yet within us abides a measure of your spirit. You are remote, but oh how near, ordering the stars in the vast solitudes of the dark, yet whispering in our minds that you are closer than the air we breathe. Turn to page 32. Avat olam beit Yisrael amcha avta Torah u'mitzvot chukim mishpatim otanu limadeta. On the bottom of 32 we read together, everlasting love, you offered your people Israel by teaching. Never remove your love from us. Praise to you, Adonai, who loves your people Israel. Baruch atah Adonai, ohev amo Yisrael. We rise on page 34 for our principal statement of faith, Shema Yisrael. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. Be seated. You shall love Adonai, your God, with all your heart. We turn on page 36, and we chant together in the Hebrew. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavecha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol me'odecha ve'hayu hadvarim ha'eleh Asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al levavecha v'shinantam levanecha v'dibata bam b'shivtecha b'veitecha uv'lechtecha v'derech u'shochbecha uv'kumecha Ukshatam leot ayadecha vehayu letotafod ben einecha Uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha uvisharecha. On the bottom of 36 in the English. Thus you shall remember to observe all my commandments and to be holy to your God. I am Adonai, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am Adonai, your God, Adonai Elohechem, Emet. And so returning to my quest to see what went on this week and years past, Emma Lazarus, one of 7 children born to New York parents Moses and Esther. Emma died on November 19th, 1887, 126 years ago this week. A woman of deep Jewish spirit, she understood what it meant to cross over into the land of freedom. She wrote, "A mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp," cries she with silent lips. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." On page 40, we recount the trip that our ancestors made from Egypt into the land of freedom with Micha Mocha. I'm going to sing a tune which might be familiar to some of you. Maybe it won't be. But we'll see what happens. The words are on the page. Micha Mocha Ba'elim Adonai, Micha Mocha Nedar B'Kodesh, Nora Tehilot Osefele, Nora Tehilot Osefele, Adonai Yimloch Le'olam Va'ed. Happy Hanukkah, by the way. Now tomorrow evening, we'll be having a special event here where there's going to be a presentation, and the topic of the presentation is going to be biblical text that is used in modern Israeli music. And we're going to take a look at, what kind of theological statements are being said, what sort of sociological statements are being said by the text that is used, and how it is interpreted through music. So I'm going to give a little preview right now. There's a prayer, or actually it's a psalm, Psalm 121, which I was hoping to have the answer to this question before I got here, because I've asked a professor of mine who's looking into it for me. In Israel, where I lived for some time and where I became a regular at a particular synagogue, it's customary, not just at this synagogue, but in many synagogues, to sing Psalm 121 at this point in the service. And for some reason, it never occurred to me that apparently it's not the custom in America to do that. Because I looked in the Siddur, in the prayer book, as I was preparing for the service, and I couldn't find it, and I thought I wasn't looking right. And so then, through some discussion, I realized that, well, this is something they do in Israel. But it's an appropriate psalm to be singing at this point in the service anyway, because if you remember in weeks past, we've gone now to page 42, to the prayer, Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu, in which in this prayer we are beseeching God to protect us through the evening, through our slumber, and help us wake up in the morning. And then on the next page, page 44, we sing usually V'shamru b'nei Yisrael, which is also a prayer about protection, about making sure things are held with complete safety and so forth. And so I'm going to sing Psalm 121, which you have the handout. It's on the page that we've not looked at yet. If you know the tune, by all means, join in. And if you catch on to the tune as we are going, by all means, step in. But the reason it's especially appropriate for me to be singing this tune this evening is because if you were in Israel, maybe today still, but certainly a number of years ago, this is a tune to a song that would have been on the pop radio stations. Kids just sing it as if it were any other pop song, although it's more than a pop song. It's Psalm 121. Shir Mahalot Esaenai El Harim Me'ayin Yavo Ezri Ezri Me'im Adonai Ose Shamayim V'aretz Al Yiten Lamut Raglecha Al Yanum Shomrecha Hine Lo Yanum Velo Ishan Shomei Yisrael Adonai Shomrecha Adonai Silcha Al Yad Yemenicha Yomam Hashemesh Lo Yechecha Vayareach Balayla Adonai Yishmorcha Mikol Ra Yishmor et nafshecha Adonai Yishmor tzitecha uvarecha me'ata ve'ad olam. We can say together in the English, a song of ascents. I turn my eyes to the mountains. From where will my help come? My help comes from It is my pleasure at this point to welcome Marcus Burstein, who basically none of you knows. But Marcus is my mentor up in New York, and he's come down to spend Shabbat with us. So invite Marcus to come up to the Ark. And Scott, if you will open up the Ark for us. On page 46, we rise. Adonai sifatai tiftach ufi yagid tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu ve'imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, ve'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, ve'Elohei Leah, El Hagadol, Hagibor v'Hanora, El Elyon, Gomer Chasadim Tovim, V'Konei Hakol, V'Zocher Chastei Avot v'Imahot, Umevi Geula Livnei v'Nehem, Leman Shemo B'Yahava, Melech Ozer Umoshia Umagen, Baruch Ata Adonai, Magen Avraham Ve'ezrat Sarah, page 50. Ata Gibor Leolam Adonai, Mechaye HaKol Ata Rav Lehoshia, Mashiv HaRuach Umarid HaGashem, Mechalkel Chaim Bechesed, Mechaye HaKol Berachamim Rabim, Somech Nofrim Verofei Cholim, Umatir Asurim, Umekayem Emunato, Lishenei Afar, Michamocha Ba'al Givurot, Umido Melach, Melech Memit Umechaye, Umatzmiach Yeshua, V'ne'eman ata l'chayot hakol. Baruch ata Adonai, Mechaye hakol. Ata kadosh v'shimcha kadosh, v'kadoshim b'chol yom yaharu chasela. Baruch ata Adonai, ha'el hakadosh. Close the ark, please. You may be seated, and we turn to page 55. And we read together on the top, "May these hours of rest and renewal open our hearts to joy and our minds to truth. May all who struggle find rest on this day. May all who suffer find solace. May all who hurt find healing on this day. Hunger and fulfillment on this day. And may this day fulfill." Okay. So at this time in the service, we have an opportunity to sit, to meditate, to choose how to use the time as you need most. You can continue reading the words that are on the page, and there's some pretty good words, or you can have some thoughts that come from your own heart. So I'll offer you some time for silence. So with passage of the historic Civil Rights Bill being held up in the summer of 1964 by a powerful bloc of segregationist senators, 20-year-old Andrew Goodman, a Jewish kid from New York City, answered the call to justice. Joining with hundreds of other freedom riders, he boarded a bus and drove down to Mississippi to help register the Negro voters there, Mississippi being the epicenter of racial injustice at the time. Tomorrow, November 23rd, Andrew would have turned 70 years old. Born and raised in a Jewish home in Pelham, New York, Mickey Schwerner was a Columbia University graduate student when he answered the call to justice. During his days at Columbia, he had been very active in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. And so he and his wife, Rita, were assigned to go down to Meridian, Mississippi, where they directed the office. This was the first time, actually, I believe that two white people, a white couple, had ever led a CORE office in the South. 16 days ago, on November 6, Mickey would have turned 74 years old. Now, the first time James Earl Chaney, a young black man who grew up in Meridian, Mississippi, the first time he answered the call to justice, he was in high school. He wore a badge from the NAACP, and he was immediately suspended from school for doing so. Now, a good student and a solid individual, he bounced back and he gained admission to Harris Junior College, and then he became an apprentice with his father in a plastering business. But his call to justice never diminished, and so he started working at the CORE office in Meridian, and before long he had risen to be Mickey Schwerner's assistant. On the morning of June 21st, 1964, just after arriving in Meridian, Andrew Goodman joined his new supervisors, Mickey and James, to go investigate a church burning in Philadelphia, Mississippi. So afterwards, as they were driving back, the local deputy sheriff, Cecil Price, caught up to the car and he arrested the three of them and he charged them on made-up charges of speeding. He said they were going twice the legal speed limit. And so he hauled them into jail, put the two white gentlemen into a cell, and with James Earl Chaney, he demanded that he pay a fine. He was the driver, and eventually the three of them came together. And after paying the $20 fine, the deputy sheriff drove them out of the city, right to the county line, and told them in no uncertain terms, never come back. After Deputy Sheriff Price turned around and the car started driving out of the county line, a group of Klansmen came up and ambushed the car, and they took the three gentlemen over to a remote area and brutally assassinated them. Now, this isn't the first time that something like this had happened in America. It was unfortunately not unheard of, but for some reason, this particular incident struck a national nerve. This is the one that seemed to be the last straw. 11 days later, after this event, the historic Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed into law. So, committed to the principles of nonviolence, Andrew Goodman would have been 70 this week. Mickey Schwerner would have been 74 a couple weeks ago. James Earl Chaney, who I neglected to mention, would have been 70 and a half exactly this week. Because they understood that in the absence of justice, there could never be peace, they understood that with justice comes peace, shalom. Because of heroes like these men, our prayers that God should grant abundant peace, shalom rav, because of them, that prayer need not remain an impossibility. Because of Andrew Goodman, Mickey Schwerner, James Earl Chaney, we know that justice need not remain beyond our reach forever. So on this anniversary of their birthdays, or the half birthday in James's case, we remember them. During this week of Thanksgiving for the blessings of America, we offer these freedom fighters our undying gratitude. And we turn to page 60. Shalom Rav, the granter of abundant peace, and we sing together. Shalom Rahava Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Shalom Rahava Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Ki atahu melech Adon Lecho hashalom, ki atahu melech Adon, lecho hashalom. Shalom rahava Yisrael amcha, tasim leolam. Shalom rahava Yisrael amcha, tasim leolam, tasim leolam, tasim leolam. We turn now to page 244 as we enter into the service for the reading of the Torah, and we rise. Ein kamocha ve'elohim Adonai ve'ein kamosecha malchutecha malchut kol olamim umemshaltecha bechol dor v'dor. Adonai melech, Adonai malach, Adonai imloch leolam vaed. Adonai oz le'amo yiten. Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom. Ahava rachamim heitiva b'tzoncha et Zion. Tivnei chomot Yerushalayim, Tivnei chomot Yerushalayim, Ki vecha levad batachnu, Melech Elram v'nisa Adon olamim. Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah, Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah, Udevar Adonai Merushalayim. Baruch Shenatan Torah Torah. Baruch Shenatan Torah Torah. Le'amo Yisrael bikdushato. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonenu, Kadosh Shemo. Galu Adonai itim, Tosh Becha. I just lost my place. Unaram Mashmo Yachdav. We can close that, please. You may be seated. So it's my honor to call for the blessing of the Torah, Tzipora Silfan. We are going to be reading tonight from Parsha Vayeshev, which is the story of Joseph, beginning of the story of Joseph, and we'll talk some more about it. We are on page 250 for the blessing. Baruch Adonai Havarach Leolam Va'ed.
ברוך אתה אדוני, אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים, ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני, נותן התורה.
Amen.
אמן.
Okay. ויראו אותו מרחוק ובטרם יקרב אליהם. So they saw him. This is happening right after Joseph has been wandering, seeking out his brothers. And they see him from a distance. And it says, so they saw him from afar, and immediately they saw him approaching. Vayitnachu oto lehamitav. And so they conspired together to kill him. Vayomru ish el achiv. And each of the brothers said to one another, Hine ba'al ha'cholamot halazeh. So, behold, the dreamer of dreams, this one. Ba ve'ata lechu v'nahargehu. So he's coming, so now let's get together and kill him. V'nishlachu be'achad habarato. So let's kill him and then send him, throw him into one of these pits over here. V'amarnu haya ra'a achaltehu v'nir'eh ma yihiyeh hacholamotav. And so they said, we're going to throw him into one of these pits, and we'll say that an animal came and ate him, and then what will become of our dreamer? Vayishma Reuven vayitzehu miyadam. And so Reuben, the oldest brother, heard what their plan was. He heard them, and he decided he was going to save Joseph from them. Vayomer lo nikaneh nefesh. He said, don't take his life. Vayomer alehem Reuven el tishbechodam hashlichu oto el habor hazeh asher b'midbar. So he said, instead of killing him, throw him into this pit here, which is in the desert. Do not raise your hand against him. Do not hurt him. Lema'an hitzil oto, he did this in order that he was going to save him, miyadam, from their hands, from death in their hands, lehashivu el aviv, and because he was thinking, I have to return him to my father, yiheh kasher ba Yosef, if I don't return him to my father's going to ask where he was. V'Yosef ele v'chayu chayav v'yifshetu et Yosef et ketonto et ketonet hapasim asher alav. And so they threw him into the pit, and they took an animal, and they took his princely robe that his father had given him, and they dipped it in some blood. Vayikechu vayishlechu oto habara habor reik ein bo mayim. And so they threw him into the pit afterwards, and this was an empty pit with no water in it.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת שחיי עולם נטע בתוכנו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen. Thank you. Okay. And so now, in the presence of the Torah, this is the time we take to think of those who can't be with us tonight, or maybe those who are with us tonight but are, for one reason or another, in need of some healing. So as my eyes wander, if you have a name that you care to share with us so that the community can keep that person in our communal hearts, I invite you to do so. Are there any others to add? Okay. So we join together on page 253, Mishaberach. Mishaberach avotenu b'kor habracha Laimotenu, may the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Mishaberach imotenu mekor habracha leavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of spirit, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, And now we rise as we lift the Torah. It is custom to try to get a peek at it, if you can, Some people lift up their fingers to get a little focus. Some people lean in a little bit closer. But however you do it, we lift the Torah for all to see. And we are on page 252 on the bottom. V'zot HaTorah asher sam Moshe lifnei b'nei Yisrael al pi Adonai biyad shemo. Thank you. So now we dress the Torah as we prepare to return it on page 256. Thank you. Hodu haaretz v'shamayim v'yarem kerem le'amo tila lecho chasidav livnei Yisrael am kerovo. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Ki lekach tov natati lachem torati al tazovu et chaim hi lemachazikim ba v'tomcheha meushar darcheya darchei noam v'chol netivotecha shalom. Hashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva. Chadesh, Chadesh Yamenu, Chadesh Yamenu kekedem. Thank you. Be seated. So in the spring of 1947, two Bedouin boys were going through the desert in the south of Israel. They were seeking lost sheep. And they came upon some caves in a part of the southern of Israel, the Negev, near the Dead Sea, called Qumran. And so they thought maybe the sheep went into the caves. But they were dark and they were deep. So instead of going in themselves, they took some pebbles and they threw them in. And when they threw them in, they heard this clanking up against some ceramic, some clay. And they weren't sure what it was, and so they threw again. They heard some more clay. And so they walked in, and they discovered that inside a whole bunch of these clay vessels was this ancient leather, it looked like, with writing on it. And they didn't know what to do with it. They didn't really didn't have much value to them. In fact, some of this leather wound up being sold to a shoemaker. But a couple months later, November 22nd, 66 years ago today, Eliezer Sukanik, who was a professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, learned of these finds. These were what we know today as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls have a whole long history in themselves that is it's worth, a semester course of study at least. But the most important thing about it is that we understand why they exist to begin with. At the time when the Romans were coming in and invading Israel and the land of Israel, and they were pushing the Jews out, there was this group of ascetics called the Essenes who were down in the south of Israel. They had their own little monastic community, and they saw the soldiers coming, and they decided they needed to run for their lives. But the texts that they had, the religious texts, were so important that they decided they were going to put them in jars, seal them up, put them in the cave, and one day come back and retrieve them. Turns out they never did. They never had the chance. But as far as our benefit of these documents today, it was caves and caves of documents, but the most important thing perhaps is that in this find, before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the oldest manuscript of a Torah that we had was roughly 1,000 years old. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was not the whole Torah, but there was a lot of text, and there was the complete book of Isaiah. And the book of Isaiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls, in that one find, brings our oldest manuscript back another 1,000 years. So scholars could compare what was in the first one 1,000 years ago, not the first one, but the one from 1,000 years ago, and compare it to the one 1,000 years later, and it is astounding how similar the two are. That over 1,000 years, the transmission of tradition and of scribes kept it almost exactly the same, just a few spelling differences here and there. So that happened on November 22, 66 years ago today, that this discovery was made known to the most important scholar who studied them. On November 19th, 1915, 98 years ago this week, Rabbi Dr. Solomon Schechter died. Solomon Schechter, perhaps you've heard that name connected with a chain of schools, Jewish schools, that bears his name. But Solomon Schechter, who became the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, the most important contribution he made to scholarship in his lifetime was something called the Cairo Geniza. Geniza is, actually, I think we discussed Geniza maybe a month ago in our session. It sort of rings familiar. But if you don't know the word, Geniza, in Jewish tradition, when you have a piece of text that is holy, and it's defined as holy differently by different people, but a good rule of thumb is that if it has the name of God printed on it, it becomes a holy text, and it is considered improper to throw out this text that has God's name on it. And so synagogues around the world and other Jewish places of study, they have special areas where when a book that has the name of God in it becomes so used that it's not really usable anymore in a respectful kind of way, when the pages begin to give out, rather than throwing it away as regular garbage, they put it into a special collection, and then at a time in the future, they will take it. If someone in the community passes away, they will typically put, along with that body being buried in the ground, they will put some of the manuscripts that have been saved from destruction in what is considered a less than respectful way. And so if a piece of paper has that sacred value, it gets a proper burial, just as a human being would get a proper burial. So again, it was 98 years ago this week that the man most responsible for studying this find was that he was buried. The Cairo Geniza, just to get a sense of what it is and why it's important, is that it's a collection that had been sitting untouched for basically 1,000 years. No, not untouched. Continued to be added to over the course of 1,000 years, but no scholar had any interest in looking at it. It wasn't really known outside of the local community so much. But if you look at the documents that are in there, you can study the development of Jewish tradition, of Jewish liturgy over a 1,000-year span, which for people who study that kind of stuff is pretty exciting. The other thing that the Geniza had was also secular material, bylaws and things and so forth. So by studying the Cairo Geniza, Solomon Schechter shed light on 1,000 years of history. In 165 BCE, after 3 years of being shut out of the temple, the Maccabees led the Jews back in and defeated the Greek invaders who were there at the time. And they went in and they went to the temple, and if you remember the story, it was utterly destroyed. There was nothing there of real value that could be used as it is, except, as the rabbinic tradition tells us, there was one flask of oil. That flask of oil had been sealed by the high priest at the time, well ahead of time of when even the priest thought it was going to be used, because they would make a bunch and put it aside. And so that one flask of oil was a kosher flask of oil to be used on top of the ark to keep the light going, which for these 3 years had gone out, and it was time to relight, to rededicate that temple. And when they found the one flask, unfortunately, it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to keep them going until they could get more. But again, as you know the story, it was enough. And so on this evening, this Thursday evening coming up, the 25th of Kislev, we're going to honor that miracle as we rededicate ourselves to living our lives consistent with the values of Torah. So those are 3 events that we remember this week in history. Switching gears. There's some TV shows I like. If you had to ask me what my favorite shows are, the ones that come up in my mind, I could go different directions, but the ones this week that come up in my mind, if you ever heard of Rehab Addict, it's a story of this story. It's a presentation of this woman, Nicole, who goes and she finds dilapidated buildings that are about to be destroyed, and she protects them. She takes them, she rehabs them, she gives them new life. Another of my favorite shows, American Pickers. American Pickers, they go, they sift through people's leftovers. They find things of value, things that have been forgotten for years. They take them, and even if they're old and ratty, if they have inherent value, they find a new home where they can be loved and respected. And Salvage Dogs. Salvage Dogs, it's a story of the salvage company that goes, they find buildings that are being torn down, and they go in and they find these treasures, they take them out, and they don't use them. They put them into storage because they figure these things are of value. We may not need them right now, but we are going to need them, or someone is going to need them in the future. And so they are confident enough in the value of these things that they put them away into safe storage. So, common thread. The common thread between these three shows, they all ask the same questions. Questions being, by what criteria do we determine what is of value and what is not of value? By what criteria do we determine what is of worth, and how do we know what the appropriate use of those things might be? And then once we know the answers to those questions, they also ask the question, how should we act in respect to the determinations? Where do these things go? They might be simple shows, but I really don't think they're so simple. It's pretty profound if you want to know what is worth keeping, what is worth putting into storage, what is worth discarding. Because once we know the answer to those questions, then we can do that for ourselves. We can know what is it that we need to keep and what do we need to put into storage, and really what's best just to get rid of right now. And so the Dead Sea Scrolls, to me, is the ancient rehab addict. It's both of them. They see something that is so valuable and sacred and important that they need to save it from destruction. They do what they can to guard it from the oncomers who have no interest in keeping them around. And so the Geniza, American pickers, they express love and respect even for the items that have no practical purpose left in their lives. They have outlived any utilitarian purpose, but they're important, so they find a proper home. Hanukkah and salvage dogs, to prepare for the future, they put things aside. They put them into storage areas, not knowing when they're going to be used, but having enough faith that they will be used. So the question we have is, what's the reason we put things into storage rather than throwing them away? What is it that leads us to that decision? And I suppose there are lots of reasons why people would put things into storage. There's excuse me. But you want to know the reasons, don't you? There's the reasons that we've said, that they want to protect things from destruction. They want to express love and respect. They want to store things away for the future. But those are all noble reasons. Those are all good reasons. But not all of our reasons tend to be noble and good and helpful like that. We have other reasons why we put things into storage. Some of us, maybe we put things into storage because we have some sort of fiduciary responsibility to someone else. Not that that's a bad reason necessarily, but the people who run these storage container businesses, they don't care what's inside. It's not the piece that's inside that has any particular value. What they care about is that they have a responsibility to the person who put it into storage to keep it safe. And so, it's nothing specifically about them, but about their responsibility. And then there are other reasons people put things away out of reach of others. And I think it gets a little bit dicey sometimes, because we can imagine that sometimes people put things away into storage simply because they don't want other people to have them. Not because it means so much to them, but because it means more to them that someone else not enjoy it rather than they get to enjoy it, because they don't really care. Which actually brings me to another show, Storage Wars. Okay, if you've seen the show, Storage Wars, people put things into storage containers, and then for whatever reason they stop paying for it, and it's forgotten, and the owners of the business put the items up for auction. And so we have this show, Storage Wars, where various either individuals or pairs of individuals go and they compete against each other to see who can buy them. But in the process, they have to determine what is it that they think is going to be of value and what is not. And so on the one hand, there's something really interesting about watching people trying to determine what is of value and what isn't. On the other hand, if we look at these characters who are in the show, they're a bunch of backstabbing, ego-driven, people who are just filled and motivated by some sort of resentment or another against each other. The first three shows I think about, it's such a pleasure to watch that these people are pleasant and they are kind and they are noble, and then there's Storage Wars. But the thing is, of those 4 shows, if you ask me what my favorite is, I watch Storage Wars, okay? But why do I watch Storage Wars? And why is Storage Wars such a popular thing? I gather people here watch it too. And I don't think that any of us really watches it because we enjoy watching these people who are so rude and angry and resentful against each other. On the other hand, what we watch them for is because I think we learn from their dysfunction. Because if you think about deals that happen in the show, more often than not, if they are bidding on things for no reason other than they just want to be nasty, somehow it always comes back to bite them. Either they lose money on the deal, or at the very least, everyone hates them. And we don't want to be that. We don't want to be in their place. So we're not watching them in order to be like them, but we're watching them in order to learn the dangers of being like them, I think. So, the saga of Joseph. The beginning of the story of Joseph, before we read, Jacob, the father, chooses one out of all of his children that he loves more than anyone else. He showers Joseph with gifts. He gives him this princely robe of many colors. And actually, here was actually, it was a pretty big story before Andrew Lloyd Webber wrote the score for it. Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. So he's there, and then Joseph, who is this egotistical, little bratty kid, he lets it all go to his head, and he has these dreams, and he tells his parents and his brothers these dreams about how he is going to be superior over them, and they are all going to worship him. Good way to make friends. So then, Joseph's brothers go out to tend the sheep, and they're out for a while, and so Jacob, the father, says to Joseph, go and check up on them, see what's going on. I'd like to have a report. And so Joseph goes out looking for them, and that's where we came up to this Torah portion that we read together just now. And in that Torah portion, in the text, we see first when they see him coming, they are so angry that they decide they're going to kill him. We can imagine another reason people might put things into storage is if they want to hide the evidence of something they've done. And certainly they were thinking if we kill him, throw him in the pit, put him away so no one can see him, they're hiding that evidence. But then Reuben, the oldest brother, comes in and he says to them, don't kill him. Better that you just leave him alone because we can't kill a brother. That's not what brothers do. But in his own head, he wasn't thinking that's what brothers do. He was thinking, if I don't return him to dad, I'm going to get in trouble because I'm the oldest, I'm responsible. So he has this fiduciary responsibility that he has to bring the younger brother back home safe. And so he's thinking, I'm going to trick my brothers, I'm going to tell them we're doing this, but I'm going to come back when they're not looking, grab the boy, bring him back, everything will be okay. He doesn't care about Joseph, but he cares about getting in trouble. So then, unbeknownst to Reuben, in the meantime, this caravan of foreigners come by, and the brothers say, you know what, better that we get something out of this. we don't need to kill him, but let's get some money here, sell him, and besides, if we do that, then he's going to pay the price, we're going to punish him, and no one else is going to have to deal with him. And so by selling him off to this traveling band, the brothers are able to really act out their resentments against Joseph. And then he goes down to Egypt, and in Egypt, partly this week, partly next week in what we read, he goes and he actually winds up in another pit down there, another story. But what happens that's of importance to this whole theme is that famine comes in. The brothers are up in Israel. The father is up in Israel. They have nothing to eat. They have gone through years and years of suffering when they sold the brother because of their resentments. First of all, Jacob, the father, doesn't even know the real story, and so he's spending all of these years in mourning. And they're stuck. They don't win in this little equation here. And then Joseph goes down, and while he's in Egypt, he, the one who had had the problem of not knowing when to discard his ego. He had such a big storage container for his ego that could have filled up 20 storage units. When he's in jail down in Egypt, it says that God is with him. And he has this change of character, that when he lets God, or when God comes into him, then he winds up being able to rise up and be a true leader. And he, because he has, I don't know if he has yet given up resentment against his brothers, but he's in the process of giving up his resentment, and he goes and he leads the entire nation of Egypt into saving the food, putting food into these storage containers, enough for 7 years. Now, most people, if they've got 7 years worth of food, they're just going to keep eating it because they don't think about what may or may not be needed in the future. But Joseph knew better, and he put things into the storage because he respected the future need for it. And when he did that, of course, famine came. His brothers came down. He saw his brothers face to face. And for whatever reason, he let go of the resentment. He cried. He cried, and he kissed his brothers. Eventually, he revealed to them who he was. They didn't even recognize him. They were so estranged. And the resentments began to fall away. And when the resentments fell away, they were able to go back to the land of Canaan, retrieve their father, who all of a sudden, once the resentments had melted away, he once again had a son, Joseph. Not only that, he came down to Egypt, all of them, and through Joseph's work, he managed physically to save himself, save his family from famine, save all of Israel from famine, save all of Egypt from famine. He was able to literally save the world. Not so bad. And what it took for him to do that was to know what to store, what to use today, and what to get rid of. So I say, dear God, we pray that you teach us to be like Joseph, willing and able to show love by shielding others from destruction. Help us to distinguish between that which should be used right now, that which should be placed into protective storage for use at some time in the future, and that which should be discarded immediately. In this way, God, we ask that you help us to preserve that which is good, and that you free ourselves, and that we are able to free ourselves from that which is bad. Our future and the future of our families, our people, and indeed the entire world hinges on our ability to do just that. So at this point, we rise on page 282, and we say together, Alenu. עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצא בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. On page 287. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ובשמו echad. May be seated. Our thoughts turn to those who have departed this earth, our own loved ones, those whom our friends and neighbors have lost, the martyrs of our people whose graves are unmarked, and those of every race and nation whose lives have been a blessing to humanity. As we remember them, we meditate on the meaning of love and loss, of life and death. The temple community this week remembers Lou Stoner, Edward Pfeiffer, Helene Marks Crawford, Joe Marks Hyman, Ida Blattner, Lynn Cohen, Irving Harris, Annie Newman, Rosie Geiger Landau, Nellie Schneider, Rose Freilich, Pearl Rubin, Mrs. M.K. Ederreich, Edward J. Faber, Lorraine Bergen, David Veron, Grace Kaplan, Charles Cormus. Are there other names that we should be remembering today that you would like to share with us, anyone? Paul Smith. On page 294, Kaddish, if it is your custom to rise, I ask you to do so now. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shmei Rabba b'alma divra chirutei v'amlich malchutei b'chayechon uvimechon uv'chayei dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala uv'izman kariv v'imru Yehei shmei Rabba mevarach le'olam ramei amaya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh V'yitadar v'yit'aleh v'yit'ala shmei d'kudesha b'richu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata da'amiram be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shamaya v'chayim aleinu v'yakol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav hu ya'aseh shalom Aleinu ve'akol Yisrael ve'imru. Amen. You may be seated. Thank you. Okay. Sipora, are you giving announcements? Yes. I'm sorry? Against your will. Then I won't listen. Okay.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
A few important things to remember. Tomorrow at 6:45, we're going to have a Havdalah service, followed by a presentation by Andy. I don't remember what it's about. Something to do with Israeli songs and
biblical text.
Music.
And biblical text and Israeli music.
Listen to him. Donations were made by Florence Present to the General Fund, and Ed Landau made a donation to the Floral Fund in memory of Rosie Geiger Landau. And we'd like to thank Lorraine and Steve Fink and Laura and Jean Renner for our beautiful oneg tonight. Have a good evening.
And we will close on page 365 with a tune we've heard once already tonight, but with other words in it on the top of page 365 in honor of the upcoming holiday of Hanukkah, Ma'od Sur. Ma'od Sur Yeshuati Lechana Elishabeach Tikon Beit Tefilati Vesham Toda Nezabeach Le'etachin Matbeach Mitzar Hambeach Az egmor b'shir mizmor Chanukah hamizbeach Az egmor b'shir mizmor Chanukah hamizbeach. In the beginning of the prayer book, on page 4. Vayahi erev vayahi voker yom hashishi vayachulu hashamayim va'aretz v'chol tzva'am vayachol Elohim b'yom hashvi'i mekol melachto asher asa vayishbot b'yom hashvi'i mikol melachto asher asa vayivarech Elohim et yom hashvi'i vayikadesh oto ki vo shavad mikol melachto Asher bara Elohim la'asot. Page 5. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu v'shabbat kodsho b'ahava uvratzon hinchilanu Zikaron lemaaseh v'reshit Ki hu yom techila lemikrai kodesh Zecher etziat Mitzrayim Ki vanu v'acharta v'yotanu Kidashta mikol amim V'shabbat kodshecha Be'ava uvratzon hinchaltanu Baruch atah Adonai mekadesh hashabbat. Amen. And we can join together in the back of the sanctuary for a quick hamotzi and then some wonderful food that has been provided for us by the Finks and Beverly too? I'm not sure. Thank you. Okay.